13 at that time, and then they were announcing winners, and then there was a kid who was 13. She was one of the winners, and I said, if a 13-year-old can win this, why can't I? And that's when I started writing my stories. Then this year, when I got this opportunity, I gave out my best because I wanted this so bad.
I'm Nkosazana Pane, and I'm from Ikageng. The title of my book is Served Breakfast. So I'm also inexperienced when it comes to writing, but I know if you read more books, then you will be able to write stories of your own, because then you are just increasing your vocabulary, and vast knowledge is going to be found when you're reading more and more books. So I guess reading more books will get you to get to know how to write.
Okay, is that right? I go on now.
She's saying unmute.
Yeah, I am unmuted. Just good afternoon to in South Africa, to all the comrades and friends who've joined us and will be joining us, but also to say a good morning in the US, where our comrades who will be helping us understand what is happening there are located. I want to start, of course, by saying that the US is so big and complicated, and part of the role of a seminar like this, introducing activists to this side of the Atlantic to politics there, will be slowly for us to get to disentangle the huge country and the variety of times and struggles and issues that go on there. But with those words, I think again just to welcome our panelists. Firstly, of course, I will mention, I'll just introduce the panelists to you very, very briefly, because I would like the panelists, they will just about later now talk and introduce themselves a bit more extensively. Firstly, to say hi to an old comrade of ours that many of us here in South Africa know, John Pape, also known as James Kilgore, who worked here, of course, at Kenya, and the comrades from Ilrig, and practically is known by all the comrades in the various movements in South Africa today. Just to welcome John to this panel, to welcome Basma Eid, and who's will also be talking to us about some of the work she's doing and the campaigns that she works on in New York, I think. An activist, again, like many of us here in the Palestinian struggle, and so on. She will talk also a little bit more about her work. Virginia Rodino, who is active in the labor movement, AFL-CIO, and is organizing immigrant workers within that context. She will also be talking to us about that work, and will introduce herself more extensively. And of course, last, Maisha Hayes, who's also an activist, as we'll see, around issues related to prisons and issues related to a major, of course, issues in the United States, the racism there, and the police violence and all those kinds of issues, and she will be talking to us. But just to introduce, to kind of bring some of our South African audience in and why this issue became of interest to us, I'd like us to play a very short clip that just will allow us not only for the comrades to introduce themselves more extensively, but for us to be able to situate why we found the issue of these elections quite interesting, and therefore why, I mean, they've raised for us the issue of movement building in the US and what we can learn from it. Is that up?
Meanwhile, in a closely watched Senate race, Democrat Mark Kelly, the astronaut and the husband of Gabby Giffords, the congressmember from Tucson who was shot in the head. Yes, Mark Kelly has unseated Arizona Republican Senator Martha McSally. We go now to Phoenix, where we're joined by Marissa Franco. She's co-director and co-founder of Mi Gente, which means My People, a national digital organizing hub for Latinx and Chicanx communities, which this year has led a national campaign to mobilize Latinx voters. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Marissa. Talk about the significance of what's happening right now in Arizona, the explosion of the Latinx vote.
The lion's share, I think the first thing to say is that the lion's share of the credit belongs to sustained community organizing in the state. The other night, you know, all of us were watching it. I think probably like many of you all, we were having this feeling of doom of 2016. And 2016, we had this moment of like, it was bittersweet, right? We finally took Sheriff Arpaio out of office, but really, you know, as soon as that was announced, it was very clear that Trump was going to win the election. And so as we waited for the results this year, and we heard about Florida, we heard about, you know, we started seeing the numbers coming out of Ohio and coming out of the Midwest. It felt really good this year to have our state be a shot in the arm. We were very excited about the results. At this point, we are still awaiting what the results are at the top of the ticket, but we have won seats at the County Board of Supervisors. The Red for Ed ballot initiative won. We've elected, it looks like, a progressive county attorney in Julie Gunnigal, and just continued to see, you know, a shift in this state. And I think it's important to name that it's a shift that comes at the efforts of many people. It is sustained community organizing, and it's an embracing of a multiplicity of strategies. This is just as much owed to the people that took to the streets and protest, the people that called for boycotts, as much as it is the people who knocked hundreds of thousands of doors to register and mobilize voters.
And Marissa, what do you think accounts for the difference in Arizona and compared to other states when it comes to Latinx vote?
Okay, thanks very much to the team for that short clip. I think the basic issue is that in the South African context, the US election has only been discussed with reference to the dominant narrative that is presented to us by not only the media here, but of course by CNN and the BBC and the various kind of outlets of the mainstream press. And there, of course, we never get to see some of the developments that I think over the last 10 years or more have been quite interesting for those of us who've tried with all the difficulties to follow what's happening there. So I think what we hope to discuss today is to focus more on trying to understand why is it that the movements in the US have been, and I've listened to a number of different stations, a number of different interviews where there was clearly kind of very high levels of mobilizing. We do know that not only the numbers not only the numbers related to these elections seem to show that. So to welcome once again our panel, and I want to give each of the panelists about a minute and a half to 2 minutes to just introduce themselves to us and tell us what work they're doing, so that we can begin, in a sense, to map out the kind of organizing and movement building that has been taking place in the US over the last few years. And then later on, we will begin to try and articulate it with some of the issues around these particular elections. Can I give John an opportunity to just introduce yourself, and more importantly, John, to tell us the work that you've been doing over the last few years and some of the mobilizing and organizing that has unfolded around that work.
Okay, thanks very much. First, I just have to take a minute to say how wonderful it is to reconnect with people at Kanya College. Comrade Opa, Comrade Maria, who I worked with for many, many years. Comrade Saratwa, who was around at the time, but wasn't quite a full-grown comrade during my time. And I'd also like to say hello to Comrade John Apollos, who I see has just come on board. So I would just want to acknowledge the important role that Kanya College played in my own political development in understanding the role of popular education and democratic structures, you know, in building a working class movement, a socialist movement. So in the United States at the moment, as some people may know, I spent 6.5 years in prison. So during that time, I obviously developed a certain level of expertise about the process of mass incarceration, the ways in which prisons work. So since I came out of prison, I've been working a lot around the issue of mass incarceration. And I try to frame that issue in a little bit different way because people tend to see people who are in prison as criminals, but I refer to them as the kind of marginalized surplus labor, the marginalized sectors of the working class, and try to build the power of formerly incarcerated people, currently incarcerated people, and their families and loved ones as a social movement to fight for social justice and to fight for racial justice. So in doing that, I've been involved in 2 projects. First of all, I've been involved with Media Justice, where I work with Maisha Hayes, focusing particularly on the use of electronic monitoring and surveillance technology on that sector of the population and beyond. And then secondly, and that project is called Challenging E-Carceration. And then secondly, I'm part of a group in my own community in Urbana, Illinois, which is in the middle of the maize fields in Illinois, small town. I'm part of a group called First Followers, which is an organization of formerly incarcerated people that provides support for people coming home from prison, and also does advocacy work to advance the interests of people who are in prison. And I want to talk a little bit more later about how all that work fits into the electoral process that Marisa Franco of Mi Gente outlined at the beginning of the session on the video.
Okay, thanks very much, John, for that introduction. As you say, we will come back to some of the issues related to incarceration and the way also it fits into issues of voter suppression in the US. And I think we'll talk a little bit about what that means. Can we just maybe take Regina, just to tell us what you do and some of the political and organizing work that you do in the US in about 2 minutes. So.
Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Virginia Rodino. I live between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. on the East Coast. I have been a labor activist for a couple of decades. I've been working in social movements since about the time of the globalization protests around Seattle, WTO, IMF, and then have been involved through the global anti-war movements, through the climate justice movements, and up to today in the movement for Black Lives. I am a member of Marx 21, which is a revolutionary socialist organization in the States, as well as the co-chair of the Maryland Green Party, So I've been active in the Green Party here in the United States also for a couple of decades. And yeah, that's essentially my background. Thanks again for having me.
Okay, thanks very much, Virginia. I think some big issues there that we're going to come to, climate issues, of course, organizing immigrant workers, big issue in the US as well. But can we just hear Basma, give us some idea what you do, some of the organizing issues that you take up?
Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. I apologize if I'm still getting my bearings. Not usually up early on a Saturday, but I'm excited to be here. So my name is Basma. I live in New York City. So that's here on unceded land of the Lenape people. So also just setting the context of the settler colonial state that we reside in for those on the US side. I organize with a group called Freedom to Thrive. It's an organization that's been around for about 2 decades that really has been working to dismantle the punishment-based systems, which are the immigration system and the criminal legal system. And so for us, you know, we really see these two systems very much intertwined, both designed to incarcerate, to separate families, and really to punish. And so we work to abolish those systems, and through a variety of strategies. We've, you know, learned a lot from comrades in South Africa. We've pulled a lot from the divestment movements. And really that's kind of one of the biggest ways that we've been able to kind of take on the so-called, you know, prison industrial complex, or what we call like the crimmigration system. So the criminal and the immigration system combined. So we've run a variety of campaigns that have worked on divesting from the prison industry, of, you know, which there are many facets, and it's an ever morphing and mutating monster here. And so we've worked on divestment, but we also, especially more recently, you know, under this former administration and, you know, within the context of COVID, really trying to do the work to get people out. And a lot of that work has sort of taken on shape, I'd love to talk about a little bit later, but in the form of kind of more community-based defense campaigns. So participatory defense, so getting folks from the community, family members, neighbors, to really be a part of the defense of folks who are inside and trying to bring them back home.
Okay.
That was my 5 minutes.
That was your 5 minutes, yes, I'm seeing. Maisha, just give us some idea also about some of the work that you do, and then we can start diving in to get a better understanding of some of these organizing dynamics.
Sure, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Maisha Hayes, and I work at Media Justice with James. I come from a background of political and community organizing. A lot of my family, close loved ones, were involved in the struggle of the 1950s and 60s, some of which were incarcerated for long periods of time. So I started organizing around prisons and jails, particularly because of my loved ones that were impacted growing up. And so I've continued to organize around a lot of different issues, but for the most part, I've been consistently organizing around prisons and jails. Right now at Media Justice, I'm the campaign strategies director. And there we focus on, you know, issues around politicized surveillance. So what sort of tools the police and the government have at their disposal to sort of surveil and harass people of color. We focus on things that are happening on the internet. So Mihete is a close ally of ours. And in fact, we definitely look to them and their leadership to understand the role of Silicon Valley and the way that they have expanded policing. So we touched on a lot of different things, but I won't go on and on. I know we have a lot to kind of dig in later. So thank you so much for having me again.
Okay, thanks very much. I think we've got a bit of quite an interesting spectrum of issues, and I wanted probably to start with what clearly is quite a big and key issue that has emerged in the U.S. organizing, and that is the relationship to the prison system, Black Lives Matters, voter suppression, and the whole kind of way in which the system of hegemony, what is really some people call a kind of a plantation hegemony of the United States operates. And I want us maybe to and maybe Maisha, we can kind of follow on straight on your thing, to just share with our audience, how does the prison system, I think in South Africa, for instance, we don't really have an abolition movement. We don't really have a movement. We had a movement in the 90s, ironically, Miles Booth, some of the people, and I'm sure John would know, who took up issues of conditions in prison. But actually, the connection of prison to the political economy of capitalism, to the way the suppression of the working class, the suppression of Black people, of Latinx people, and so on, of Native Americans and so on works. So to talk a bit about the place of that struggle in the broader understanding of the struggle against US capitalism and US hegemony.
Wow, sure. I'm going to try. My other comrades, please hop in if I'm not giving the whole history of the prison industrial complex system right. But like generally, I think a good place to start is that a lot of people here sort of believe now that slavery sort of evolved into what we have now as prisons and jails. So for instance, we have a couple of different prisons and jails that literally have very deep and direct connections to slavery or the enslavement of African people here. So one of the campaigns that I worked on here was Close Rikers. Rikers Island is a very notorious jail in New York City, notorious jail for the entire country. And the jail is named after someone who essentially made his fortune off of selling escaped enslaved people back down to the South, and bought this land that at one point was kind of a hospital, but actually, became a jail and a prison. There's Angola prison down in Louisiana, another good example of how, when slavery ended, basically this new institution of slavery, which is jails and prisons, evolve and replace those systems. So there's a lot of amazing literature about sort of the evolution of slavery into jails and prisons, and how prisons have basically been used to as a tool to continue the social control of Black and brown people, and also provide an economy, I guess, for people to work in that.
Okay. Okay, Masha, let me bring in James here to maybe talk about this. In a way, the thing about the prison, James, maybe you've done, as you were introducing to us, some work in a recent book. I mean, how the prison system relates really to the way, firstly, the powerful ruling elites in Washington, maybe to kind of and Wall Street, as they call it in that sense, but also to look at how we're thinking about organizing in that space, not only in what in South Africa, for instance, Miles Booth would be just what the conditions are in the jails, but how that links to the broader kind of emancipatory movement and in the US. A little bit of that, Jay. You want to come in?
Sure, a couple points. I think one of the points that Angela Davis makes repeatedly is that prisons have been used to solve the problems of capitalism. So if people don't have houses, if people have substance abuse problems, if people generally have problems of poverty, instead of providing resources for those people, we build jails and we build prisons. And so that has become an industry. But I think it's important that we recognize that it's not primarily about private prisons and profit. It's a political project. It's a political project to push back against the movements of the 60s and 70s, and to make sure that they don't regain control, particularly over urban spaces. And so I think one of the things that's happened in this past election, but over the course really of the last 10 years, is the fact that people with felony convictions, people with criminal backgrounds in many states have been denied access to voting. And this has prompted a national movement of formerly incarcerated people to fight for the right to vote. And I think this came out a lot in this election. I mean, I was part of a national network of organizations of formerly incarcerated people in different parts of the country that were pushing voter registration and getting formerly incarcerated people out to vote in order to really reinsert the power of Black voters in particular into the electoral process. Of course, from my perspective, particularly having lived through the enfranchisement of Black people in South Africa, we know voting has very limited power. So we need to be able to take the mobilization that happened around voting and convert that into a broader organization that fights for social justice and connects the struggle of formerly incarcerated people and currently incarcerated people to the struggles of the broader working class on housing, substance abuse, healthcare, and so forth.
Okay, thanks, John. I just want to come to bring you in here, Virginia. I think one of the things that has been kind of in the news here in South Africa and kind of cropped up in the course of these elections is the whole kind of detention, the exports, the separation of children that has happened as Trump has attempted to kind of build his border. And of course, that has affected a lot of the kind of immigrant workers that you have organized in this question. I'm interested in how the struggles of the Asian American workers in that sense have been linked or have linked to these struggles around incarceration and so on, and I think more interestingly, what has been the role of the labor movement in taking up these kinds of issues that are clearly of major concerns, given that huge percentages of Black and Latinx communities end up in American prisons?
Yeah, I mean, I am not an expert on the prison industrial complex. However, what I would say is that it's connected to the immigrant justice movement of today. And so right after the election and actually building up to the election, we saw on the West Coast in California, a day of action to abolish ICE because of the detention of immigrants and the connections of the suppression that both Maisha and James talked about, and kind of the intention, what is the intention of the prison system? And so we see now innocent people being detained indefinitely with no charges and so on. So I think that is impacting kind of the immigrant and refugee individuals in the United States. So it's just one other application of this complex. In terms of what organized labor is doing, I think actually it is more the movements from below that have been organizing and have been pushing both the institutions of labor as well as politicians to try to do the right thing. But it's absolutely the movements from below that have continuously done the work, even when there's not a spotlight on them, that allows them to, have a moment when the movement is strong, when there's the spark, and I think that it's those types of movements that have been steadily organizing in their communities. That have done the real work, even though it seems like, oh, it just happened yesterday, but it hasn't. I mean, for years and years, families of incarcerated, as well as the community organizing that is done around immigrant justice in particular. So I would say that. I would say there is a massive piece of it being of the for-profit prisons and these institutions, just used to make money for capitalism is an important piece that we probably shouldn't gloss over.
Shall we bring in Basma in this? Now, my interest, Basma, what I'd like you to pick up on, I think in some of the issues you've mentioned are like the disinvestment campaign from the prison industrial complex. Now, my interest a lot is for you to talk a bit about the methods of organizing in this space of the various issues. I mean, you've taken up a lot of things from Palestine to Islamophobia, a lot of things that are connected. But I'm interested in the US, what seems to interest in people talk about neighborhood organizing, a whole range of movements that seem to talk about. Just listening to Mirente when I was trying to follow what they're doing in Arizona and other places. Can you talk a bit about what are the methods here? Is it media work? Is it actually committees in neighborhoods? How is this work being organized? What are the methods of organizing? Can you talk about that a bit?
For sure, yeah. And if I can actually also add a little bit to what Virginia was just talking about, I'm also someone who did a lot of work in the immigrant rights movement here in the United States, in New York, particularly amongst immigrant workers who are often kind of left out of big labor. And so for immigrant folks who are dealing with all sorts of issues on their job, of course, they're also dealing with issues of housing, issues relating to their families, and of course, immigration. And so it's interesting that we sort of started this panel with that clip from Arizona. And so for folks who you know, obviously the US is a big place, but of course Arizona for a long time, you know, especially under, you know, the prowess of terrible people like Joe Arpaio, who was mentioned, the sheriff who really pushed these sort of anti-immigrant laws, like SB 1070 back in like the early 2010s, 2008, 2009. You know, those were sort of targeted at immigrant workers, and the way that those sort of policies that where if you look like you're an immigrant, I'm gonna, you know, stop you and ask you for your papers and funnel you into the prison system, into immigrant jails and detention, I think is super crucial to kind of to draw that out. And so for us, when it comes to divestment, you know, we were seeing these types of raids on immigrant workers on the West Coast, across the states. And really, I mean, for us, when it came to divestment, it was kind of understanding, well, you know, why, you know, what's pushing these raids? And like James said, of course, it's not just about profit. It's not just about making money. There is a system of xenophobia, of anti-immigrant, anti-Blackness that, you know, perpetuates this country. But yes, there is also these motives from, you know, major corporations that are in bed with politicians, with local government, that secure these lucrative contracts that make billions of dollars. You know, the majority of immigrants who are in jail, in immigration jail, are in private facilities, about 81% or 82%, something like that. And so for us, when it comes to divestment, you know, the ways we sort of pushed these campaigns forward was, you know, one, it was working with folks on the ground, working with communities who, you know, saw their loved ones, saw their neighbors basically be disappeared. And then really it was about asking questions and getting to the research and understanding, you know, who are these companies, where, you know, who's financing them. A lot of our kind of strategy in the beginning of this campaign was understanding that these corporations can't act on their own, and that it was really, you know, Wall Street, it was big banks that were giving them revolving lines of credit to inflict this type of harm. And so kind of figuring out, you know, what are the connections between Wall Street, between the prison corporations themselves?
Just to say, Pasba, and maybe John can follow you on this question. You see, here in South Africa, we maybe there's a lot, and I'm thinking about our audience listening to this saying, look, but they're trying to visualize, are these civic movements, are these organizations in a neighborhood? Are people members of this? Or is this more like WhatsApp, media campaigns? A little bit of that, just half a minute, and then I'd like John to come in on that and to see what do the movements look like in terms of their organizational structure. I think what we see is huge masses around the marches around Black Lives Matter, but we're trying to imagine what this ongoing organizing looks like.
Sure. Yeah. I'll just say that, you know, divestment has happened across different sectors of the population. So we've worked with university students who have tried to push their universities to divest money from this industry. We've worked with workers who are trying to push their pension funds that have also been invested in the prison industry. We've worked with artists and cultural workers who are, you know, pulling their work from major museums that have direct ties to the prison industry. So it looks different across, you know, depending on the campaign where you are, but for sure it's very much working with people. It's, you know, centered in political education, letting folks kind of really understand just how deep this system is, and, you know, focusing on not just folks that are, you know, immigrants, but all folks who are incarcerated. I think there's and we can talk about this too, but there's a huge divide between, you know, the immigrant rights movement and the quote unquote criminal justice movement here in this country.
John, you want to come in? Just so pick it up on the issues of organization?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's probably a little frustrating for South Africans is that South Africans are used to national organizations. They're used to organizations with well-defined structures, elected leadership. They have annual congresses, or they come up with resolutions, they act on those, they report back, and there's a whole set of structures like that. And so people, when South Africans, I think, are looking for Black Lives Matter in the streets, and they want to see that national structure. It doesn't exist. That's not how these organizations operate. I mean, Black Lives Matter has kind of what they call a distributed leadership. It's more local. It's more people share ideas and they share strategies, but there's not a central plan that everyone acts on together. So what Basma is talking about is lots of local struggles, and then people come together through networks. They connect their struggles, but they don't come together under a structural umbrella that has a general secretary or a president or any kind of structure like that. Now, coming from my experience of South Africa, for me, that's both a weakness and a strength. You know, it's a strength because it doesn't get you tied into into a bureaucratic leadership that takes you down political dead ends, but at the same time, it limits your ability to campaign at a national level. So I think that's part of a struggle that goes on in the United States in terms of how do we build more power to make more change. And I think in amongst formerly incarcerated people, we have actually made some efforts to have national organizations that come together, probably more so than in a lot of other sectors. I want to just make one other point, though, if you don't mind, very quickly. I think for the most part that trade unions have been an obstacle to a fight against mass incarceration. I don't think trade unions in general have viewed people who are locked up as part of the working class. They're criminals. And we've seen the same thing even happening within the immigrant rights movement, that there's this division between people who are innocent and people who are guilty. These are people who are a product of the way in which capitalism has cast off certain sectors of the working class, and we need to build ties across immigration struggles, across criminal legal struggles, and across broader working class struggles, like the fight for the $15 an hour wage and so forth. And it's only when we have those kinds of connections that I think we're really going to have the kind of power that we need to push back against all the bullshit that Biden's going to start ramming down our throats now.
Thanks very much, John, for picking up, because I wanted to pick up actually on this issue of how the trade unions, AFL-CIO and all of them, have actually related, as you say, to a range of these autonomous movements, the anti-prison movements, the abolition, the migrants movements, the housing movement. I've seen occupations of housing, sometimes whole neighborhoods being taken up by communities that have refused to move out of that. Virginia, do you want to just reflect for us from your kind of vantage point of being an activist in the movements, in the left, and also in a way having a kind of a position where you also active in the labor movement, as to how and what are the debates in the US about the role of the labor movement in these growing mobilizations that some of us think is happening in the US. A bit of a reflection on this, picking up on John's point.
Yeah, I mean, at least at this moment, but I think I've seen this in many of the other movements. They've engaged quite poorly. So I think I've seen that organized labor is running to catch up, just like politicians, they run to catch up to the movements. In terms of the movement for Black Lives, organized labor had the ability, the resources to put out a call and say, okay, dress up in your union colors and come out on the streets and get your banners out and so on and join these protests from the top down. But the only time they ever seem to really do that is when there's an election, and that's when big labor organizes and sends out, expends an enormous sum of money to get usually some Democrat into office, either successfully or not. So it's actually quite frustrating as an organizer and as an activist and as a socialist to see this, because in terms of the institutions on the left, organized labor is one that has probably the most money, you know, is one of the institutions that has the most resources for the left. And to see that be spent on, you know, I think a failed strategy of propping up a political party that does not represent the working class. And as, you know, a union member, as someone who paid dues into this, it's, you know, it is heartbreaking actually, because we could do so much more in terms of organizing workers in big sectors into unions, for example, or supporting actual movements. So I think that it is a long-term.
And maybe just to follow on this, I'm just interested to know, because I've seen instances where, for instance, there's a whole wave of teacher strikes that took place. There's been a kind of a wave of workers in Amazon taking up issues, sometimes kind of crossing over with some Black Lives Matter issues. Is there, besides the dominance of this union kind of bureaucracy and its ties to the Democratic Party, is there other union initiatives, other union forms that are dealing with workers, with immigration? Because here in South Africa as well, we face the dilemma that the big unions, very tied up to the status quo and big parties, and then desperate and difficult attempts to organize in the base. What can we learn from the US about, is the organizing in the base, notwithstanding that? Because I mean, like we've seen some of this.
Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, just to follow on about the unions.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, the teacher strikes, like in West Virginia, are a good example of what you're asking about, because it was in spite of 3 different unions that the teachers actually had the success that we all saw. So if you talk to those organizers, those teachers who organized on the ground, and what they were being told from the union bureaucracy, it was opposite of what they actually ended up doing. So I think that's the perfect example if you uncover, you know, how that organizing went and what they were instructed to do. Yeah, it is incredible. And if you see what the response is from the upper echelons of labor in terms of those rogue unions who just recently said, we'll go on general strike, we'll call a strike, you know, if Trump doesn't leave the White House peacefully or whatever, they were not supported, I would say, by the top bureaucracy of the AFL-CIO for calling those strikes. And you see that throughout history. So I think it's sometimes in spite of the union bureaucracy that organized workers, militant workers fight back. And sometimes they have to, unfortunately, stand up to their own union bureaucracy.
Thanks for those thoughts. Basma, I just want to shift ground a little bit. I mean, one of the things that struck me a lot in looking at the kind of struggles in the US has been, I mean, like a real major presence of women, very young women activists. And I'm interested, I mean, like just having looked at some of the historical debates on these issues, do you think, and how do you guys reflect on the shifts in the presence and the participation of women? Is it reflecting firstly in the way you're organizing, in some kind of different way in all these localized campaigns? Is there a self-conscious attempt to define the role of women as being central in this? And how is it influencing, you think, the politics around mass incarceration, which of course focuses a lot as well on men, because the majority of what you call, I read recently that there's a very rapid increase in women being incarcerated, I think, listening to John in one of his things. But I mean, can you just talk about the position of women here and where we think, and I'd like probably Maisha to also follow on this, young women, which I'm seeing increasingly being kind of the face of the major demonstrations in the US.
Sure, I can speak a little bit to that. I mean, quite honestly, I don't think it's something new. I think it goes beyond just women. I think a lot of people who have historically like oppressed gender identities, whether they're women, gender nonconforming, transgendered, folks have often always been leading these movements, but have never been given the attention. And especially when it comes to the fight against mass incarceration, you know, the folks that I think about are all Black women who are leading this movement. And I think, like you do make a good point. I think there is a lot of attention around, you know, cisgendered men who, yes, are incarcerated at high rates. But women there are a lot of folks who are incarcerated, and you know, we do a lot of work, particular around people inside, and there's a huge sort of just like an ignorance almost, or there's an overlooking of folks who are trans. And we do a lot of work with trans migrants, for example, especially here in New York, who are often, you know, trans women who are being incarcerated with men, who often experience all sorts of oppression and violence within the hands of the system and of other folks incarcerated with them. And so, you know, yes, of course, there's been a lot of movement, but I don't think necessarily it's something new. I think that often these have been the people who have always been sort of leading, and you know, in the fight against mass incarceration and the immigration movement, and sort of broader worker economic rights movements, you know, thinking about the teacher strikes and a lot of the really, like, you know, rank and file driven movements here in the United States are run mostly by women, honestly. And so, yeah, I don't know if other folks want to add to that. I'm no expert, but that's sort of just my perspective on that.
Yeah, I don't want to be repetitive, but I think you captured it perfectly, Basma. I think that, you know, Black Lives Matter started as a hashtag on Facebook in response to the killing of Trayvon Martin. And that hashtag was created by, you know, Opal, Elisa Garza, and Patrice Cullors, who are 3 Black women who are immigrants, who are working class folks, who are queer, so of course, like, the movement preceding that is going to be representative of all of those struggles. And I think that a big reason why we don't see this sort of like bureaucratic leadership organizing our movements is to allow for different kinds of leadership to connect these issues. Because it's our belief here that if you work towards achieving justice and freedom for the most marginalized in your community, then that actually gets everybody free. So that's why you see a lot more of that today.
I just want to add one point.
John, yes, John, yeah.
I just want to add one point to what Basma and Maisha are saying, which is really crucial. But I think to look at who's impacted by incarceration, it's not just the people who are locked up. And for years and years and years, it's been mostly women, mostly sisters, mothers, grandmothers, daughters, granddaughters that have looked after the people who are incarcerated, put money on their commissary account, visited them, taken care of their needs, and also handled the parenting duties and so forth. So it's really, I mean, from my own experience, I can say that in many ways my family suffered more than I did because they had the burden of carrying all these extra responsibilities, whereas I had to do the time, but I didn't have duties and responsibilities. I just had to survive. So, I think the point is that Black women have in particular been at the forefront of that. And I think the most important organization of formerly incarcerated people is the National Council for Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls, because they're the ones that are the most active and take the strongest positions of pro-abolition and have an internationalist perspective. So and also don't have a lot of ego battles at the leadership levels, the way we see in some of these other organizations of formerly incarcerated that are dominated by men.
He's on mute.
I'm on mute. What I wanted to just a very short follow through from John about the relation between the prison complex and the schools, what people call the kind of the supply line almost running through the schools. How strong is it in the US? I think people are beginning to talk a little bit about it here. And then I want to move a little bit to some of the organizational issues related to the way the movements understand their organizing, and starting also with you, John, you can kind of run onto that. Now, what is the attitude of the movements to not only the Democratic Party, but I think what I've found interesting in the US is that not only do you have, of course, the elections to of Donald Trump and Biden, but there's a whole host of other issues, referendum on the in California on the issue of Uber, and then some people are picking up stuff on the rights of people to vote in particular states because of also the federalized nature. In the progressive movement, what are the debates about the relation to the state institutions, to these platforms, in particular, of course, to the Democratic Party? And if you can pick up on that, John, and I'd like probably Virginia to also follow through after that.
Well, I think probably Maisha and Basma could speak more eloquently than myself on the connection between schools and prisons. But I mean, just in general, I think we can say that schools have become very, particularly schools in Black and brown neighborhoods, have become very, militarized. There's armed police in the schools. There's metal detectors. There's all kinds of disciplinary actions which end up landing young people in what they call the school to prison pipeline. They go to juvenile court, and pretty soon they're being groomed to go to prison. That's their career path. In terms of the Democratic Party, well, I don't think many people think the Democratic Party is really the solution to everything. So I think people had to make a decision. Are we going to vote for the Democratic Party as much as we detest most of what they do in order to get Trump out and then go back to fighting against the neoliberal demons that we knew from the Obama days? Or are we going to stand outside the process and think that it doesn't really matter who's in power? So I think those are the two kind of positions. I think for the majority of people that are involved in social justice movements, and other people can correct me, I think for the majority of people felt we have to get Trump out of power. That the threat that he poses is too great. He's a fascist. He's a white supremacist. He's a militarist. He has no redeeming values, and he's opened the door to white supremacists organizing and mobilizing on the ground, which is a threat particularly to people of color, but a threat to anybody who's really in opposition to what they do. So I think that's the dominant position, but it's difficult because now, do I want to go out and organize for the Democratic Party? Hell no, I don't want to do that. But do we go to the Green Party? And Virginia can speak to that. What do we do? What are the alternatives in that? Do we go to work at local levels at elections, or do we simply try to mobilize people to be able to fight outside of the electoral sphere? And I'm sure everybody else has a lot of views on that.
To just pick up Virginia on the same issue of relating to the Democratic, but I want to just maybe you focus on something besides the Democratic Party at the tops, the peak bodies, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and all those people. There seems to be a lot of participation and use of the various instruments that are offered by the way the US regimes are kind of organized. Like, for instance, I'm interested, for instance, does the left people organizing have particular kind of thoughts on using these referendums that are done by the states? People are always voting in these elections, of course. We only hear in South Africa, the top elections. I made an example, for instance, of the propositions in these issues. Shall I pick up on that, and then I can come back to Maisha? Maybe she wants to pick up on those issues too.
Yeah, I think it's its own meeting, actually, in terms of the reliance on reform. It's the question of reformism, right, versus real change. And so I think electoralism is not the ultimate answer. You know, it could be used as a tool. It could be used to help build movements. However, you know, I think what we've seen, maybe not just recently, but certainly in the past, that, you know, the Democratic Party is where movements go to die often. So like during the vibrant anti-war movement during the peak of the Iraq war, you know, with Obama, both the fight for universal health care, for example, and against, you know, troops out of the Middle East, both of those movements really just went to sleep and never really came back. And so I think that you know, that's a problem with liberalism, that's a problem with reformism, that it doesn't bring ultimate change. And I think those kinds of disappointments, you know, demotivate, de-escalate, and just turn off the mass movements. Now, I don't think for sure that Biden generated the same amount of hope that Obama did, you know, which is good. So I think that that's right, that people were skeptical. No one was voting. Not a lot of people were necessarily voting for Biden. They were voting against Trump, and that is different. And the youth today, I think, are necessarily and obviously just more skeptical, and they're not blindly trusting in the actual systems. It seems to me that they're not tainted by, oh, we have to either go Democrat or Republican, and that these are our only choices. If they see something's wrong, you know, they say it, and it doesn't matter who's in power. So I think like the climate justice movement, I think the student movement against guns and violence in schools, you know, preceding that, recognized that politicians weren't the answer. So I think that's a good thing. But I think ultimately, really the answer is not necessarily electoralism, but it actually is building up the movements. I think that's the way that we get real change. And what we're going to see in terms of the attacks around abortion rights and so on, if we looked at how women got abortion rights in the past, it was not through any elected official or referendum. It was through movement in the streets. And I think that's what we need to build up ultimately.
Okay, Masha, I'd like to talk a bit about this because of some, again, of the work comrades are doing there. Because, I mean, let me just give you a little bit of a background to this question in the South African context. Yes, there is a lot of the understanding that the ANC here will not deliver a lot of progressive change. But there's a strong current among activists here that are still tied to the fact that the state itself, its referendum, its local state, in the US, you have, I've listened to elections of the sheriffs and so on. Can you just speak about whether you've used these kinds of state institutions and what have been the political debates around them? What can the South Africans listening to this say, look, okay, fine, we know Biden and where Obama belongs and where all these people, but is there some kind of attitude in our local campaign, in our local councils? Are these useful, or activists are acting entirely outside of the state system?
I see what your question is. Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question. I think I want to echo the fact that, like, nationally, the election definitely, for the most part, for a lot of people, was just making sure Trump didn't get another 4 years, because he is the worst president we've ever had. I think that the question you're asking about is whether or not activists and people that are in the movement see local organizing as a pathway to get some of as a pathway to achieve some wins. I think that's true to a certain extent. I mean, there are certain issues that have a big impact on the local level. So for instance, issues that are around prisons or jails or policing, a lot of those issues get dealt out at the local level. It's not necessarily a national issue. So in New York, right, like if I'm particularly passionate about the school to prison pipeline, and I want to make sure that 16-year-olds aren't tried as adults, I need to do organizing at the local level within my city and within my state to pass legislation to change those things. And so when when you're asking about whether or not we see opportunity at the local level, you would definitely have to consider where people are, because the politics in New York are not the politics in Texas, just like they're not the politics in California. And so I can speak very specifically about whether or not I see, and I think New York is a good example of like why Democrats aren't really the answer. And I think it's a really good example of why the Democratic Party is going to continue to see a lot of challenges and a lot of issues in the next 4 years, because over the summer, we saw the largest movement for racial justice we've ever seen. And on election day and election week, we saw Black and brown people come out and really carry over this election. And then within a matter of 2 weeks, Democrats are already saying that they only won by a small margin because of Black Lives Matter. They're blaming the very people that literally saved this country from the next 4 years of Trump as the reasons why they had a small margin of win. And, you know, and you said at the beginning of this conversation, like, you know, you're seeing the elections from MSNBC and the mainstream news. And I get really worried about what people think around the world when they see that MSNBC is saying Joe Biden's the most voted for president in United States history. Well, think about the context, right? Like, people were really scared. We had a president right now that has been woefully inept around the pandemic. That's a really big thing we haven't talked about yet, right? And so, like, with all of that being said, like, for the Democratic Party to then turn its back on the movement, that the very same people who went out to vote for the Democratic Party no matter what because of Trump, it's a tricky situation. But I think, and I say that you see that replication even at the local level, because I'm in a place like New York. We are, you know, very blue. We are very Democratic in our state legislature, and our you know, our governor is a Democrat, but it's very hard for us to get things through because Democrats are, you know, have similar interests and, you know, hard to move just like other politicians. So yeah, it's a tricky question to ask, but I'll leave it there if anyone else wants to chime in.
Okay.
Yeah, I would, you know, I think
yes.
just the one thing. Yeah, just the one thing to add, and, you know, I'm not a member of the DSA, of the Democratic Socialists of America, but I think it is important to bring in, you know, that there are attempts of building alternative structures to a two-party system in this country. And, you know, there is a lot to say about DSA, but I will say, as someone who also, you know, lives in New York and has seen on the local level, like, what a new slate of, you know, actual progressive Marxist politicians could look like for this state. I mean, I think there's a lot of possibility there. And, you know, my idea of liberation is not coming from anyone in an elected office. But I think that we do have to recognize that there is room, there's multiple strategies that are needed. And I think that there is some movement, you know, if we're even thinking about the quote unquote, the squad, or the election, you know, the recent election of people like Cori Bush in St. Louis. I mean, I think it's really important to reckon with that there is some new energy coming into elected politics that can continue to try to push that pendulum a little bit. But, you know, are all of our hopes there? No, absolutely not. But I don't think it's something that we have to completely ignore and pretend like there isn't an opportunity there.
I'm going to come back to Basma because I want to pick up other issues. John, I mean, I think Basma has opened up an issue that I think is of interest here to people. They what I call the left congressional Democrats, AOC and Cori Bush and the, what do you call it, in the movements. I mean, like maybe following on Basma's things. How are they viewed in the left, and maybe or are they just well, sometimes when you listen to some of the stations in the left in the US, it's like don't go there in the so in the political work on the ground that you do, is there a sense, I mean, as Basma says, that look, these are positive forces for the left?
Yeah. I mean, I think in many instances they are positive forces. I mean, they raise issues for that no one else will raise and get them into the public sphere. I think also, and I think Maisha could speak to this quite well in the sense that, you know, doing our own organizing, we've worked with electeds who have driven the issues that we want, take them into the state legislatures, take them into Congress. I mean, Maisha's been involved in a number of national campaigns which have involved engaging with national bodies, governmental bodies that needed the intervention and the support of electeds who are willing to do that. So I can just say at my local level, we have a fantastic former grassroots organizer, Black woman state representative named Carol Ammons, who has helped us push all kinds of issues around the criminal legal system at the state level, but also a whole range of other issues. Without her, we wouldn't be able to do much in the state legislature or get some of these issues on board. So I think these people do play a very important role, but you always have to keep an eye on them because those career nuggets, those career jewels, get dangled in front of them, and all of a sudden you find that they're the chair, the national chair of the Democratic Party or something, and you've lost them. But yes, at these moments they're really crucial. And Maisha, maybe you can talk a little bit about a couple of the campaigns you've been involved in, because I think they're really.
Okay, yeah, Maisha, follow through.
Sure. I'm talk about like one campaign. We have a campaign called Protect Black Dissent. That's about the politicized surveillance of Black activists in response to an assessment that was leaked a couple of years ago on Black identity extremists. And that's a campaign where I was certainly in DC a lot, talking to staffers, members of Congress about what they can do to support activists and actually question the FBI. So people like Ilhan Omar, who's part of that leftist squad, was one of the people that spoke at our briefings. Rashida Tlaib is another ally. Those people do make a big impact. I think that they are forced to be reckoned with in Congress, and I think that's really important. However, they're also just a small group of people. Like, Congress is huge. And so even though I get really excited when we develop these really positive relationships with people, I suddenly realize, damn, like, I see now what they're dealing with, which is an entire Congress of people where Democrats are very neoliberal and very center liberal, right? And so there are things that it's really hard to get things through, even if you make great relationships with people. So, I think that's kind of the issues that we've been seeing.
I wanted to go back to Pazna and then move on to other issues. Just the issue of Palestine, which I think in South Africa, it sometimes has more, if I may say so, sometimes more sentimental attachment to the struggle for Palestine than actual organizational and political. Every party in South Africa supports the Palestinian struggle, from the ANC, besides a few of the old extreme right. But we never get any breakthrough. I thought, Basil, can you just speak maybe to our South African comrades about the Palestinian struggle, its challenges in the US, which I think are huge given the huge strength of the Zionist lobby in Israel. And I think recently South Africans, I think, got a bit of a shock with the simple closure of talks that were supposed to be held in the US by Laila Khaled. Just about sharing with us the organizing around the Palestinian issues and where that organizing is.
Yeah, that's also its own conversation for sure. It's, of course, like you're saying, it's no secret. We're here in the belly of the Zionist beast, of the Zionist lobby. I think that, as someone who grew up, being politicized around Palestine, but as it relates to kind of global solidarity with occupied people, there has been, moments that have given me a little bit more hope recently. I think that we have seen that Palestine has entered a little bit more into the mainstream, even amongst, to be quote unquote left in the US does not mean that you're anti-Zionist, unfortunately. And I think that that's finally being pushed and challenged in a lot of ways. I think that there's definitely a sort of new, younger generation of folks who really understand how central liberation in Palestine is to kind of global struggles around liberation. I will say it's not easy, obviously, organizing around Palestine. I think, even in the work that I've done around divestment, around prison, the prison industrial complex, the moments when we've seen the most success and the most kind of promising kind of success has been when we've been able to sort of bridge connections across, the BDS movement, folks that have been organizing around divestment from fossil fuels and kind of climate destruction and divesting from the prison industry. I think that's been really an incredible kind of opening to sort of bring these issues into into unison and not kind of thinking about Palestine as a separate issue. Or, I feel like here you have people that are either progressive only on Palestine or they're progressive except for Palestine. And so I think there has been some sort of coalescing around, across movements really. And so that's been something that I've been hopeful, it's given me hope. And even around divestment, at the university level, we were able to, one of the first places where we got divestment to pass around the prison industry was Columbia University, which also, was one of the first universities to win divestment around divestment from apartheid in Palestine. And so I think that's something that's been really important for us to kind of see these connections. And when we talk about, all prisoners are political, and we can't forget the number of political prisoners and prisoners that are held in the occupation jails in Israel. And kind of building those sort of the solidarities across incarcerated folks has been super important. There's a lot to really say, I think, about organizing around Palestine here. I'm someone who I've done a lot of work around refugee communities and folks in diaspora, mostly in Lebanon, when it comes to Palestine. And so I think it's important that people here who, especially under Trump, were, getting so upset about the Muslim ban and the refugee ban, kind of forget some of one of the largest groups of refugees are Palestinians. And so I think there's been opportunity for us to really kind of center that narrative within sort of the struggles that are happening here in the US, and sort of having that global perspective and that international perspective kind of has been a big strength, I think, for the movement here.
There's kind of some questions that have come through. I just want to kind of, the first kind of issue maybe to pick up before is clearly the US is seen as quite with the presence of a fairly large and powerful media from the ruling classes, and I think some of the participant here wanted to know how have you organized around media justice issues? How have you created counter spaces to tell kind of the narratives related to the struggles that you're taking up? Because again, I mean, just a quick South African point is that the media here has become almost completely dominated by the mainstream, by the corporate press. There is the idea, I think John would be shocked if he found the complete absence of an alternative press, which even under apartheid had some kind of presence. So can we just maybe talk about that? Maisha, you want to pick up on that? And then Virginia, how do the left organize around these media issues? And then I want to come back to some of the issues of the questions that are taken up about feminism and in the US and in the movements.
Sure. Well, I mean, a lot of us work at nonprofits that are greatly resourced for us, so we can spend a lot of our time doing political education, which these days is happening like this all over Zoom. And so we're seeing a lot of that happening. At Media Justice, we focus on something we haven't quite touched on, which is we have a whole area of work around platform accountability. And for us, we believe that a lot of the understandings that we have about our information ecology, our media systems, need to really expand to include Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms that we often use to get information from people. And these are platforms that have been really terrible at moderating disinformation, misinformation. And by the way, the difference between the two is basically misinformation is sort of unintentional false information, whereas disinformation is, intentionally trying to spread false information. And this has been really a big issue since the pandemic hit, because obviously people are looking to Twitter and Facebook for information, and when Facebook is not taking down or flagging things that are coming from white ring nationalist extremist groups, you're putting people's lives at danger. And so some of the ways that we combat how media and technology spaces have been distorted and misused to hurt communities of color have been to create networks, right? So we have a whole network around that's called the Disinformation Defense League, where we gather groups to talk about, and expose folks to trainings like how do you identify misinformation, what's the history of misinformation, right? Because this isn't really anything new. Media and newspapers have long been used to spread propaganda and problematic information about our communities. So how do we understand today's disinformation as a legacy or as a continuum from the things that we've seen in the past? And then what are some practices that we can use to flag things that are incorrect? So I'll stop there because I see you're off mute.
Yes, yes. Virginia, do you want to just say something about, is there, I mean, like, you're a member of kind of left groups and actually in the union. What is there a left media of some sort organizing? And then I want to pick up with John and Basma again about some of the issues, John, around feminism that the audience is asking about. Virginia, just follow through on the media space. Is there left press, or is this kind of very, very localized again?
I mean, I think there is a left press, and then in the moment, I think there are a lot of micro press sites, right? So individuals can start up there. You can be a political blogger, and depending on if you make the right decisions, you can build up an extraordinary following as an individual. So there is kind of in the moment that space to do that. There's just millions of competing voices today. So I think the political education by the movements is important in order to kind of be able to sift through all of the competing voices. In terms of the traditional media, I mean, I don't know if folks remember, particularly folks in the States here, about how Trump dominated the news. You know, each and every day there was something breaking, something ridiculous breaking from the White House. And the one thing that kind of stopped that was the enormous movement that broke out in the streets. And so I really just go back to the one way we can do this to get our messages out and break through, you know, the corporate stronghold of who has the media platform, you know, is to build a big movement where the majority of people, the majority of Americans in the street are on the same page. And it was a multi-class, multi-ethnic, very diverse movement where no matter where you turn, people are saying this isn't right. And so I think, you know, that's our task. It's really to build a gigantic movement where everyone agrees, you know, on some basic premises. And in terms of what we saw a few months ago with the movement for Black Lives, that's what happened.
Okay. Can I pick up John? And maybe we can follow through with some comments as well. Now, I think that there's been a question here about, I think we spoke earlier, and I think, let me read Maria's question here, because we spoke earlier about the clear, the kind of presence of young women, Black women, brown young women in the movement. Would you say, John, there's, knowing some of the South African concern, there's a kind of a feminism in the movement? And I'd like to hear what the other comrades say. Or is it the women are present, but is there an understanding that there's a feminist concern? Because I think the question has come up there, and it's popped up again there, that given that the presence of Black, brown, and young women, what has this meant for grassroots feminists in the US? John, can you pick up on that, John? And then I'd like to hear what the other comrades say.
Well, I guess as the only male on this panel.
Yes, I know,
maybe
John.
this question should land. Not that I can't talk on this, but I don't want to be the expert. But
no.
So I think just quickly, what I would say is that I think there's still a struggle around issues of race and class, around the issues of feminism. So, and I mean, we've encountered this just in the struggles around the criminal legal system, that we have a stream of feminism that's dominated by middle-class white women that is very what we call carceral feminism. That is, they want to solve problems by locking people up, and that really negates the experience that Black and brown women in particular have with policing, have with the criminal legal system. So, for example, if you take the issue of gender-based violence or domestic violence, that the solution that mainstream feminists pose is we have to have stiffer penalties for people who who engage in domestic violence, and we must have more police to be able to respond to these situations. And the response that's come from grassroots Black and brown feminists is calling the police in is not a solution. In fact, it's likely to enhance the difficulties, the challenges, the problems that people face when the police arrive, because they don't necessarily want the person that's that might be involved in gender-based abuse incarcerated for 15 years. That they want to solve that problem. They want to stop the violence and not bring in police who then find other ways to harass and arrest people and incarcerate them. So I think that's just one issue where we see the contradictions between different strands of feminism. So I'll stop there and hand over to others.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, John, because in South Africa, and I want Maisha to probably pick this up and follow through, Maisha. In South Africa, this is the dominant feminism among practically all the different strands. Arrest, incarcerate, stiffer penalties, and I'm interested, and the argument that gets put here, and Maisha, I'd like you to talk on this, is that, well, the criminals must be punished and that the community wants them to be punished. And I'd like to see how in the US your movement has taken up a counter argument to the fact that the only solution basically to this violence in society is more police, more prisons, stiffer sentences. I mean, there's been a lot of demonstrations here by the women's leagues, by feminists, Black feminists and others, basically saying incarcerate, incarcerate, incarcerate. And their arguments are the communities want this. How have the activists in the US taken this up to counter this kind of politics? Maisha?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess first of all, I'll just share that I often follow Black feminists, feminist abolitionists like Miriam Kaba, Patrisse Cullors. So I'm regularly kind of like following people who already have a politic around abolition that's also rooted in feminism. So kind of like what James said, there's a whole community of Black feminists who have been, working around prisons and jails to uplift the fact that when you actually listen to survivors, and that's the other thing that I think is complicated about this conversation in the United States, is that for a long time, our depiction of who was a survivor of crime often centered around white women, when in fact, like Black and brown people, we come into this conversation wanting to get Black and brown people out of jails and prisons, but we don't often talk enough about how Black and brown people are also survivors of crime, survivors of abuse and harm, right? And so when you actually center, and so when I'm listening to people like Miriam Kaba, who are saying, like, when you actually listen to survivors, most people actually don't want their abuser in jail or prison. They just want a process for accountability. They want, and this is broad, right? So I don't want to say that this is true for everybody. I can't speak for everyone who has survived abuse or violence. But her and other folks have pulled up a lot of information, a lot of data that speaks to this, that people in the community want accountability. They want, justice to be served, but putting, people in a cage for a long period of time isn't really justice. And something that James said earlier on about like women being also impacted, right? Not just women who, first of all, women are the fastest growing demographic of people in jails and prisons, first of all. But then secondly, as James was saying, a lot of women are like sisters, mothers, aunts, like family members, right? And so you're also impacted. So there's definitely that divide, but I will say that the movement, at least because of the leadership that we have today, has really sort of changed that narrative and pushed the field into thinking about really centering the voices of broad groups of people to reframe what our solutions can be. So
I think we kind of winding down on so many topics and issues that we can take up. And I want to maybe spend the last 4 minutes, I'm told by my controllers, to ask you a question to all the panelists. I think what has been clear from organizers around the movements is that everybody's clear that the return of Obama incarnated as Biden and all of those things is not the solutions to the host of issues that are being taken up by the movement. In fact, the movements, from what we've read, have had a bit of a tough time in certain communities in convincing people to come out, given their experience of the Obama years and who they, the people that they've seen being lining up in Biden. I want to just ask the panel a general question, and maybe you can have your closing remarks of this. 2 questions. One is, isn't I think John made the point that the localized nature of the movement gives a certain strength to the movement. But given, of course, the unified and strongly organized nature of American capitalism, isn't that also a weakness, and are there prospects, to comrades things, of some kind of cross-cutting alliances, movements, issues, joint campaigns, and all of that, without probably John coming with the negative effects of a bureaucratic. And my last question, of course, is where do comrades see the next step in the Biden administration, which is supposed to have saved America and saved the world? We'll start with John. Let's start with John, and then we run through the other comrades.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure where the process is to develop a stronger national coordinated structure. Certainly, we've seen the national uprising. We've seen. I mean, I've seen uprising. I've seen that uprising not only in New York and Chicago. I've seen it in Anna, Illinois, this little town that's like 20 miles down the road from me, that was a sundown town where Black people weren't allowed in the city limits after sundown. And then white kids are coming out with silence is white is support for white supremacy, Black Lives Matter. So this has been a national uprising. So I think we need to recognize that it was led and spearheaded by Black Lives Matter and Black youth in particular, but it was a national cross-class interracial uprising. So I think we need to reflect on how we convert that into a structure. I think we have some national networks that provide some ways of maybe moving toward this, but I still think it needs a lot more reflection. And I know that people, in Black Lives Matter, that the people that Maisha is, cited, Patrice Cullors and Opal Tometi, they're thinking about this along with lots of other people. So, but yeah, we have to do that. In the meantime, we have to make sure people don't get complacent, that we have to fight Biden on it's going to be a battle every step of the way, much harder than it was under Obama. And we have to recognize that, they're going to try to use the fact that, well, if you don't support this, you're supporting Trump. They're going to try to use that against us. So we have to continually expose the bankruptcy of the Biden and the Democratic politics. I know I'm used more than my 1 minute, so I'm going to share. I'll stop there.
No. I think John, you didn't overstep too much. Let's take Basma. Where do we go from here?
Yeah,
Biden in power and all of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, lots of places to go. I mean, I think, as James said, I think we, in movement space here on the ground, we can't let up for sure. I think that in a lot of ways, I'm not going to say this was a positive of this last administration, but obviously it woke people up to an extent. I think that when I think back in 2016, I think people are like, well, if Hillary had won the election, no one would be in the streets. And quite honestly, that's probably true, especially given kind of the state of organizing here. I think that we now have an opportunity to kind of keep the momentum up on the Biden administration. I mean, it's no secret who he's appointed into his cabinet. It's Obama 2.0, 3.0. It's nothing we haven't already seen. You know, folks in the immigrant rights movement, we know what Obama did when it came to deportations. We know what Biden is probably planning on doing as well, no matter what he says around returning DACA and all these other sort of immigration policies. I think we have to keep up, and I think we have to keep kind of building internationally. I think as someone who has an international perspective, we need to kind of break the sort of myopic, US-centric sort of organizing vision that doesn't relate and doesn't connect with folks across borders. I think that's super key. And yeah, I mean, yes, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Baza. It's gonna be a big fun. Virginia, where do we go? Your last thoughts?
Yeah, so just to about the last conversation around feminism and so on, I mean, I think it's important not to equate women and girls with feminism too. Like, I think identity politics sometimes throws us off track, at least with building the U.S. left. So Bernie Sanders is much more of a feminist than Hillary Clinton, you know, or Kamala Harris in terms of the policies and stuff. So we have to look at the politics, and we can't get derailed by identity politics. So just following those questions in the chat. So I think, you know, it is important to build a feminist anti-capitalist movement, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all women, you know, have the right answer, because we saw women coming out for Trump. You know, we see women wanting to incarcerate more, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to put that out there. I think the movement has the same struggles that we have to continue fighting under a Biden presidency, as unfortunately as under a Trump administration as well. I mean, I think there are different opportunities and there are different challenges, but it's really the same struggle, because you know, neither party really represents a working class interest. And so we see Biden reverting back to let's be polite and civilized status quo, but that means, you know, the same, you know, awful, disastrous policies, both domestic and foreign. So our struggles remain the same. And I think in terms of bringing the movements together, you know, just as a project of Marx 21, which I belong to, and I'm going to reach out to my fellow panelists here, we are working on a united front against Trumpism and against racism, because Trumpism is going to exist after Trump. It existed before him in terms of the white nationalism, white supremacy, and structural racism. And so what we saw with the movement for Black Lives was, again, like an enormously diverse national masses of people coming together under a very broad, simple, you know, message. And that's what we want to, and we need to build upon. So we are building a united front against racism, against hate, because we see signs that Trumpism is going to exist, the kind of the violence. I mean, attacks and violence against people of color increased under an Obama presidency, you know, because white nationalism was stoked and so on. So we can imagine that with Kamala Harris in the White House, that the same is going to happen. So anyway, I think building a united front against racism, against Trumpism is important, and that's something that I personally am involved in, and that could be one way of trying to draw people back under a very broad umbrella to stand up against what the horrors of what we saw over the past 4 years.
Thanks very much, Virginia. Maisha, where do we go from here? Your thoughts, and then we're wrapping up as we wrap up.
Yeah, I'll try and make it brief, but two things come to mind. I think the first thing that's on my mind is, you know, I think the left, our public, just needs to get real about what white supremacy is. And the fact that we still have a really serious problem with racism in this country. And that if we actually only think of it as Trumpism, if we only see Trump as like the boogeyman, then we're going to be in serious trouble, because we won't be able to identify how racism is actually very pervasive in all systems that we interact with. I think a lot of people are going to see I think a lot of people as Tabasma was saying, like Trump woke up a lot of people, but what does it say that you only got woke in the last 4 years? What were you doing when Trayvon Martin was murdered, when Mike Brown was shot, when, you know, Sandra Bland, like what are people doing outside of that? And I want people to not get asleep because we have Biden in the White House. We need to be real and get ready about what it means to actually unpack and decolonize our own selves from the history of white supremacy and racism in this country. The second thing I will say is that the left needs to get more disciplined, but less dogmatic. So what I mean by that is I think we need to do a better job of including more folks, educating more folks, you know, trying to expand like our access to folks in community. But I don't want us to get dogmatic. I don't want us to get to the point where like I think there's a lot of paranoia right now and a lot of trauma in the activist movement circles from the last 4 years. And so there's a lot of like, if you're not a Bernie person, you can't be in this room. And if you're not this, you can't, you know, like, I think we need to find a way to be really disciplined about our politics and how we move together, but not in a way that replicates the sort of exclusion that we see in the systems that we have to exist in. And so, because I think there are a lot of people that got awake the last 4 years and are committed to being in the movement, and I think that energy needs to be harnessed on. But I see a lot of like the left sort of like biting at each other, like fighting with each other, and that's always been true and that's always been the case. But I think that because of the illusion that we have got out of racism, because we have now defeated Trump, that we're all good now, like I think we have to be even more disciplined about how we invite more people into our politic and organize with folks.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Masha. I think, comrades, we've come to the end. I know there's been very interesting discussions that have happened also in the chat that I've tried to kind of keep track of. And I think we're hoping that this, we thought of this as introducing activists and opening up to activists, especially our broader, some of our activists, to some of the issues in the US. Important, and I think, as Basma said, thinking of ourselves as internationalists, thinking of ourselves as learning from each other, the way comrades were talking in the chat room. And I want to extend a very heartfelt thanks to the comrades from the US who are organizing, as someone said, in the belly of the beast. I always think when we're organizing in South Africa, I say, I mean, I don't know, it's a lack of the draw where you're born, and organizing in the US must be horrendous. It's a massive military industrial complex. It is quite a nasty sorts of racists and white supremacists, and it's like, you know, just following the kind of the murder of Black people by the system. And I think it's always great to know that no matter how difficult organizing is, there will be comrades that will rise. And I think, as John said, look, I mean, it was quite astonishing. I mean, like 25 to 30 million people in the streets, you know, in the smallest area is no small thing. And I think, Maisha, I think for me, the point you make about that combination of imagining a whole new ways of organizing while being disciplined is probably what we hope that we'll also try to take home here, because I think we do suffer from that problem as well. It's a kind of a global disease of the left, a combination of ill discipline and dogmatism, which can only breed what you call. Look, I think we could only talk so much in what is a huge country, a politically vital and important country. Of course, we think that every left person everywhere hopes that the US movement makes headway, because when they make headway, we also make headway. And I'd like, with those words, to thank the comrades. And of course, again, no partiality meant, to thank John that we've reconnected, because, as I said, he's got a special place here at Kenya. He was director here for a long time, and at ILRIC, and we've kind of grown to know each other at the level of family, at the level of the kids that were growing up. So it's really great when we say, the comrades are like picking up this battle and we marching on. Thanks very much to everyone, and thanks, John, in particular, and hope that we will keep in touch.
Thank you, Comrade Opa. Much appreciated. And a quick hello to Comrades Muteto and Moses on the line there.
Yes, yes, okay. Right. Okay, thanks, comrades, and goodbye. And onward to the new battles. and you know that we're there too with you.
Down with Biden, down.
Down with Biden. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, comrades, for joining us today. And to our panelists, I would just like to invite you to join us tomorrow as we wind down the JBF weekend. So we have like two events. We're launching two books, and then we're also going to have an event titled Transformation and Movement Building Beyond COVID-19. They are both quite interesting events, and they are the last events of the 2020 12th Joseph Book Fair this year. And I hope people can join us tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Hey, Moses. You got a mic, Moses? Oh, yeah.
I'm going to hop off. Is that cool?
Sure, yeah. Thank you, Maisha. Thank you so much for getting. I know you don't normally rise and shine on Saturday mornings like this. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, this was a lot of fun. Thank you.